Chapter 3. Calys. It was close to midnight when they reached the edge of the Everglades. The eerie atmosphere fed the legends surrounding it, and shifter packs that lived within and beyond the forest of towering pines did what they could to keep the stories alive. The more terrifying the stories, the better, for it kept prying human eyes away. Alejandro was looking around us warily. I don't like this. In truth, I felt the same way. There was just something foreboding in the air, making me feel swallow uneasily. We should go back and leave in the morning. In front of us, Pasquale laughed. Did you hear that, men? The werewolf is afraid of the dark. Ewu. Obnoxious laughter from his men followed his joke, which had been one of the many. It was evident Pasquale wanted to make up for the embarrassment he had suffered earlier, and he took every chance he could to pick a fight with Alejandro. We can't risk going up against Raul if it's true he set up to ambush us. I didn't stop walking as I spoke. Even in the dark, it was easy to navigate my way around the forest. This had been my home for over 18 years after all. Why can't we? Alejandro demanded under his breath. I answered simply, because it would mean pointless bloodshed, and I will always do everything to avoid that. Alejandro didn't answer. When I glanced at him, his eyes bored through me and I pursed my lips. I knew what he was thinking even without him saying a word. Clearly he didn't think Pasquale's men would be any great loss. I was trying to think of a superhero quote to teach him about the importance of protecting innocent lives when I heard a rustling sound. I froze. Did you hear that? Alejandro pushed me behind him. Stay close. In front of us, Pasquale and the rest of his men had also gone still. A line of nervous tension formed around the prince's mouth as he said stiffly, I do not hear anything. Another rustle and then, Calys, is that you? A sigh of relief escaped me as I identified the voice and spotted a familiar figure emerging from my left. It was Jurian, a forest ranger that had been assigned to our territory over a year ago. Alejandro still hadn't budged in front of me. Who is he? Jurian came walking towards us, still in uniform, with a backpack slung over his shoulders. Hi, Yuri. Unable to get past Alejandro, I was forced to poke my head out from behind to smile at him. Tall and fair with the same baby blue eyes as mine, he would have passed as my twin if his hair wasn't more white than gold. Hello, Calys. It's nice to see you again. He looked at the men behind me curiously. Pasquale was suddenly at my side. Introduce me to your friend. His suspicious tone made me realize that all the shifters, including Alejandro, hadn't heard Jurian coming until he was right next to us. Maybe it was because he was here all the time and able to use the forest's noises to mask his footsteps. Mentally shaking my head at the mystery, I gestured to Pasquale. Pasquale, this is Jurian. He's one of the rangers assigned here and a close friend of the family. With humans, we always referred to the pack as family since it was safer that way. Jurian, this is I faltered. Although it had been a week since our engagement, I realized that now was only my first time to introduce Pasquale as my fiancé. He was my fiancé, my future husband, but he wasn't the one who had me half naked hours ago. His name wasn't the one I moaned and screamed, and he wasn't the one who had made me come so hard my body went totally limp after. Pasquale took my hand and brought it to his lips. Your shyness is becoming princess. His action and words were unexpected. They were also something I wasn't used to, and I found myself flushing as I felt everyone looking at me. Still clasping my hand, Pasquale told Jurian, I am her fiancé, Pasquale Hernandez. He said it like he had announced he was king and he expected Jurian to kiss his feet for it. Unbidden, my gaze strayed to Alejandro. His eyes bored through me like he was begging me for the right to knock some humility into the panther prince. I looked away hurriedly before I could end up giggling. It's nice to meet you. Thankfully, Jurian didn't appear to mind Pasquale's obnoxious tone. Glancing at me with concern, he asked, Isn't it kind of late for you all to be out here? Pasquale had already rejoined his men, leaving me with Alejandro. Looked at him for help, but he only shrugged. We're here for our research. Lies always had me stammering. I gestured to Alejandro. He's a writer. Oh. I could see Jurian had a hard time believing me, and I couldn't really blame him. Alejandro, with his in-your-face good looks, appeared too flamboyant to pass as a writer. You're writing a book? Jurian asked Alejandro. Fearing Alejandro's answer, I said quickly, yes. About what? I searched madly for a topic, and all I could think about was reality. About vampires? Jurian blinked. Really? Beside me I could feel Alejandro trying to glare me into shutting up. Yep. Fiction. Like there's, Eddie? And he likes, Belle. That sounds like Twilight, Jurian said. I blurted out. Did I mention Belle's a guy too? Jurian looked at Alejandro with interest. It is true, Alejandro finally said. Crap. Alejandro was really going to chomp me into pieces after this. As I tried to think of something to say that could prevent my death, Alejandro was speaking again, asking Jurian about his work. Yes, I know this place like the back of my hand. I see. Would you mind accompanying my air team for the meantime? I've just realized I have one last thing to do before I can leave the city. This was news to me and I couldn't help but ask, where are you going? Alejandro. Calys' expressive eyes belied her casual tone. She was jealous. Should have made Alejandro happy, but it only pissed him off. Whose fault was it that she couldn't straight out say what she felt? Pasquale loudly claiming to be Calys Adelardi's future husband still grated on his nerves, and it was one of his reasons for leaving her side. If he stayed 1 minute longer in their company, Alejandro would really end up killing Pasquale. He hated it, he goddamn hated it every time he saw Pasquale touch Calys and not have the right to do anything about it. But he also had another reason for leaving, one more pressing and one he didn't want to tell Calys about until he was sure. To Calys he gave a mocking bow and said, It's my off-duty hours, princess. So I'm afraid I don't owe you any answers. I'll come back as soon as I can. Stay close to Mr. Ranger here. Jurian was frowning. If you are under her employ and were hired to guard her, you must not stray from her side. Alejandro snorted. Trust me, she is no shrinking flower. She is a woman and as such, she must be protected. So this boy not only looked like a fucking angel but he spoke and thought like one too. Alejandro knew there was a reason why he hated him at first sight. Baring his teeth in a smile, he said, It's a good thing you're here then. Turning his back on the ranger, he bowed to Calys again. I'll see you soon, princess. And then he left to start killing vampires. He had noticed the bloodsuckers following them the moment they got past the city limits. No one should have known they were taking this route to reach the Adelardi lands in the north. But the vampires had known, which only meant they had a mole among them, and Alejandro was determined to find out who it was. Changing to his lichen form, he loped through the forest, his preternatural speed turning him into a blur. He spotted them a few meters away from where Calys was and clawed his way to the top of a tree, and then he watched and waited. They were young and inexperienced vampires, their powers fed by bloodlust but not much else. It took them a full minute to realize they were not alone, but by then it was too late. Alejandro Moretti had already learned what he needed to know. Took bare seconds to decimate their numbers. Blood streaked his thick white fur as he slashed their throats with his claws. The air around him began carrying the stench of death, and soon it would reach Calys and the others. It was Alejandro's warning to whoever was snitching on them. He would be found sooner or later, and when he would know what would be the end of him. Alejandro left one alive for him to interrogate. The vampire was on the ground trying to crawl away from him. Shifting to human form, he landed one light kick on the vampire's side, enough to have his body flip on the ground and the bloodied creature looking up at him. Damn. This was no vampire. It was a shifter, a hyena, and one of the men he and Calys had fought when they were at the den. Who sent you here? He demanded. Answer me truthfully, and I may not kill you. A scarred man, the hyena choked. Not shifter, not vampire. Something different, but not human. Sometimes he smells like he's decaying. From in Chapter 7. Calys. A knock sounded on my door at promptly 10 minutes before 7, the exact time Alejandro told me he would be back to accompany me to dinner. I hurried to open the door, but my smile faded when I saw his face. Gone was the tender lover I had been with the whole night, the one who had woken me up with kisses and even served me breakfast in bed. The werewolf in front of me was as handsome and as powerful, but his face was devoid of expression. My voice faltered. Is something wrong? He shook his head. No. His lips curved in an odd smile. You look beautiful. Thank you. I had dressed carefully for tonight's dinner, knowing that appearances were a must. Not wanting to look too young or too feminine, I had opted for a pinstripe jacket and matching skirt. You look good too, I mumbled. Alejandro was dressed as formally, also in black and white. I knew he was only a couple of years older than me, but when he looked like this, he felt light years ahead of me. He took my hand. Are you nervous? Yes. But it wasn't for the reason he thought I was. He was the one who made me nervous, but even I couldn't explain why that was. Alejandro held my hand as we went down the stairs, heading straight to the dining hall where representatives from the Panthera awaited. Before we enter, you should know that your cousin Raul is also here, together with a few members of your pack. I stuttered to a stop. Why is he here? The Panthera invited him. Alejandro's hold on my hand tightened. Whatever happens, I am here for you. Remember that. I shook my head. The truth was beginning to sink in. The whole Panthera might not believe me. They might think I was behind the deaths of Pasquale and his pack members. I could tell them that they were the first one to attack me, but it would be my word, an outsider's word, against a panther whose reputation in life had been beyond pristine. They might sentence me to death. I didn't realize I had said the words out loud until Alejandro said very decisively, "No." Protectiveness glittered in his gaze. "I won't let anything happen to you. Remember that." And then he was pulling the door open. The men inside the room stood up as I entered. There were 8 men and 2 women. 4 of the men were from the Panthera. The rest consisted of Raul and his companions. It was always hard for me to look at Raul. He looked so much like Veneto, and the resemblance was heartbreaking. He could have been a brother to us if he wanted to. We would have loved him and faithfully served him, but he hadn't wanted that. He would never want it because he wanted to be Veneto's only heir. "Thank you for granting us your time," the man standing at the head of the table murmured. Benito was an old friend of my father, a silver-haired man who held the highest position in the Panthera. "You know everyone here, I assume." "Yes, Your Majesty." Benito, like my father, was also alpha of his pack. Glanced at Alejandro. "May I introduce my cavalier? Prince Alejandro of the Lickin Morettis." "An honor," Benito murmured. "The honor, Your Majesty, is mine," Alejandro returned. When Benito inclined his head, all the men took their seats while Alejandro pulled back the chair at the foot of the table for me. This placed me adjacent to Raul while Alejandro sat across him, right next to one of Raul's female companions. "I would like us to enjoy this meal in comfort," Benito began, "and as such I believe it would be better if we postpone our talk tomorrow. This is fine with you, Calys." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Raul." "Of course, sire. Whatever you think is always best." He had always been obsequious, my cousin. Course after course was served. The food was delicious, but all of it tasted like ashes in my mouth. The roast beef placed in front of me made me want to puke. It reminded me of the scene inside the cottage when Jurian had flown me back to the place at my insistence. I had wanted to be sure that Alejandro was all right. He was, but the others were not, all of them reduced into bloodied pieces of flesh on the floor. The thought caused my hand to shake, and my knife slipped from my hold, clanging to the floor. Almost all eyes went to me and I flushed, mumbling an apology. The server behind me moved to pick it up, but I shook my head with a polite smile. "It's fine, I can do it." "I will fetch a new knife right away, Your Highness," the server said with a bow before turning away to leave. Bending down, I reached for the knife, and that was when I saw it. The woman next to Alejandro was doing her best to fondle Alejandro under the table. In his defense, he kept moving her hand off his legs every time she reached out for his cock. He was trying, but in my opinion he wasn't trying hard enough. I straightened on my seat. The woman next to Raul smiled at me, a Cheshire smile that made me want to lunge at her and scratch her eyes out. "Everything all right, princess?" Her voice was mockingly solicitous. I sent the knife flying, and she screamed as it zinged over her head, pulling out a strand and nailing it to the wall behind her. She was still screaming. "Please relax," I said in the same solicitous voice. "I have very good aim. You had nothing to fear of." Alejandro's profile had become tense, and I knew he had realized exactly why I was furious. Then again, it wasn't really that hard to guess why, was it? Are you insane? The woman, Dolly was her real name if I recalled correctly, demanded, her voice shaking with fear. Not at all, I answered politely. I just take offense when someone attempts to touch what's mine. Realization dawned on her face and she laughed, the sound jarring my ears. Are you talking about this beautiful man next to me? Surely you're being too possessive over your cavalier? It's not like he's your consort. Without looking at Alejandro, I said quietly, he is the man I love. Silence followed, one that I hoped Alejandro would be the one to break. But in the end it was Raúl who spoke. And there it is. He threw a contemptuous look my way. The reason why she had Pasquale Hernandez and his pack members killed. And the death knell of our pack if she becomes queen. Alejandro. Alejandro stood before Calys' bedroom door, a drawn expression on his face, his body stiff with tension. He is the man I love. Even though dinner had long been over, Calys' last words kept echoing inside Alejandro's mind, which still grappled with disbelief. Had she really said that? And in front of the Panthera and her enemies? His fists clenched in frustration. If he had doubts before, he had none now. His princess was extremely good at making things more awkward. Hell, most awkward. It wasn't only his mind that was affected. His heart was too, the way it had been thundering against his chest since he first heard her speak the words. God damn it, why did she have to say that? Why? Didn't she know those words would make it impossible for him to stay at her side like before? Slowly he raised his fist to the door. He only had to knock twice before Calys opened the door. She looked tired and scared, and he knew he and not her almost dying was the reason for it. Would you like to come in? He nodded and she stepped aside, closing the door behind him. After Calys walked to stand in front of him, gnawing at her lip, she looked at him as if waiting for him to speak. When he didn't, she blurted out, "Aren't you going to say anything?" He said tonelessly, "I am." She held her breath, but seeing her do it only made him furious. With her and himself. God damn it, why did she have to do that? Why was she setting herself up for pain when he had laid everything so damn clearly to her from the very start? He said flatly, "You made a mistake." Calys shook her head, confusion clouding her expression. "I don't understand." He spelt out, "You made a mistake about saying you loved me." "But I didn't." When he didn't say anything, she insisted, "I didn't. Alejandro, I love you. I know I do. I've known it for a long time." She had known she loved him for a long time. She had loved him for a long time. God damn it to hell, why did she have to say that? Why did she have to feel that? Then I'm sorry. It killed him to look at her, but he knew he owed Calys at least that. "I'm sorry you feel that way." He could have said something more. But he didn't, knowing it would amount to nothing. What was the point? In the end, his decision, his feelings would remain the same. He would not allow himself to love her back. When he turned his back, Calys cried out. The cry was filled with so much pain he spun around, wondering if she had somehow hurt herself. Tears were running silently down her face. "Just like that," she whispered. "After everything, you're going to leave me? Just like that?" Why, goddammit, why did she keep asking questions that were too damn awkward to answer? He forced himself to shrug, to turn away once more and move towards the door. "I'm going to check on what your cousin is up to." "Look at me," she begged. He reached for the knob. Behind him, Calys said brokenly, "You don't really care, do you? You just want this to be over. You've lost interest in me because I'm no longer a challenge. I thought I was different, but I wasn't. After everything, I'm just like all those women. You took them and left them." She choked on a sob. "I'm right, aren't I? Aren't I?" His hand shook as he turned the knob. It took everything in Alejandro not to say a word, not to look back, not to stop moving until he had shut the door behind him. The last thing he heard was Calys crying. Warriors never cried, she liked to say, but she was crying now. Crying so damn hard it was as if she could no longer breathe. God, God, God. Make her stop crying. Make her realize what he knew. It was safer this way. Chapter 1. Once upon a time there lived a race of winged creatures. Their wings were every shade of the rainbow, and they could soar so high into the skies it was as if they could knock on heaven's doors. These creatures were known as Suri, and the first of them were angels sent to earth and made mortal. They lived quietly among themselves, deep in the forests and high in the mountains, so quietly they faded into myths and legends. The innocent and the just, wise humans and loyal non-humans, all of them, eventually forgot about the Surus' existence. But not the damned. Those with evil in their hearts circled their land day and night, waiting, skulking, knowing there would come a time they would have a chance to destroy and desecrate the Surus' idyllic existence. One day that moment came. Jealousy had filled the heart of the king, for he thought his people loved the queen more than him. Blinded by greed, he became vulnerable to the insidious whispers from the dark. Day by day, his angelic blood was poisoned by his own thoughts until there was no trace of humanity left in him. And so amidst beauty that only the gentle-hearted could create, the king turned into the first Vidange. Like the Surus, this new soulless race was not immortal, possessing wings 1,000 times more powerful than the largest and fiercest bird. But unlike the Surus, they were not heaven's children. They were from below, and forever they would dwell underneath the earth. Half of the angel's offspring became Vidange, seduced by promises of power and wealth by the king. The other half remained loyal to the queen, their hearts grieving for the loss of innocence in their land. A battle then ensued, and no part of the earth was saved from it. Blood rained down from dueling warriors, fires raised fields that once bloomed with the rarest flowers, and dead bodies drifted among lakes that had turned crimson. From azure, up in the tower, a young prince was able to defend his beloved mother by killing his own sire. But alas, it was not the end of their cursed days. The king's first act as Vidange was to strike an unholy alliance with the soulless. Guided by his traitorous words, vampires and the sin-eaters were able to find the chamber where 3 precious babes rested. They took all 3, knowing one of these infant girls was the queen's beloved daughter. It was their hope that they could one day force the queen's daughter to mate with the king's bastard son, a Vidange like him. Such an offspring would have great power, perhaps enough to rule the world. But fate intervened. Tormented by his guilty conscience, a Suri who had not yet completely lost his soul and become Vidange sought atonement. At the cost of his life, he was able to escape the Vidange and hide the babies in the mortal world. One of those babes was Calys. When the queen discovered her princess living among the panthers, she chose to love her daughter from afar, knowing that Calys' life was safer with the shifters. She had hoped that Calys, despite being known as the human monster, would be able to lead a life blessed with peace and happiness. But it was not to be. Vampires had found their way into Calys' world, and sooner or later they would know that she was no human monster. She was more, and when they realized who she was, they would come for her. Calys. It was the 5th day for the Panthera to gather, this time to hear the sides of both accuser and the accused. The room was vast and airy, large windows, allowing rays of sunlight to turn the wood-paneled walls a darker shade of brown. The room was the largest in the inn, where locals and guests mingled for town festivities. But this morning was completely different, with one person's sentence the only thing to be celebrated. Alejandro Moretti, werewolf prince, stood directly behind Calys Adelardi. Small, blonde and blue-eyed, the princess he had sworn to protect remained calm and motionless in her seat. At first glance she appeared innocent and vulnerable, but those who were aware of who and what she was knew better of course. She was not called the human monster for nothing, and today if Royale Adelardi was to have his way, she would soon be known as a murderess as well. Thoughts of Calys' cousin had Alejandro reluctantly looking back at the younger man. He stood tall and proud at the center of the room, and it was clear by the look on his face that he loved being in the limelight. Royale Adelardi loved it so much, Alejandro thought, that he probably wouldn't mind killing again and again if that was what it took to stay there. She is human. Royale spat the last word out, a fairly predictable way to start his closing speech. The contemptuous look he threw at Calys was just as predictable, and Alejandro almost cracked his knuckles at the sight of it. The others in the room were not shifters like him, able to hear 1,000 times better than humans. He would have done so just to let the little shit know Alejandro was this close to taking his life on the spot, and to hell with the consequences. That alone should disqualify her as being heir to the Alpha. Sickens me thinking that a human, with not a single drop of panther blood in her, was made heir of our pack, one of the oldest and most respected of our race. Only, out of respect for my beloved uncle did I not say a word, but now? After what happened? Raoul furiously pointed at Calys. It's clear for everyone to see that she's the one behind Pasquale Hernandez's death. Raoul opened his mouth to speak again, no doubt to spout more lies, but one of the Panthera intruded, his voice reasonable as he asked, "And what is your evidence for such a claim?" Raoul's gaze swung away from Calys, the lichen behind her. Alejandro stiffened. It is evident that she is in love with the wolf, and because of that she's regretted her decision to marry Pasquale. Perhaps they've gotten into an argument. Or maybe Pasquale refused to let her go. We will never know what happened between them, but what we can be sure of is that she wanted him out of the way. If she can do that to her childhood friend, how are we to know that she would not do the same to her own adopted father? Calys burst out of her seat, and she would have rushed to Raoul if Alejandro hadn't already anticipated her move. He held her back just in time, and when he felt her trembling hard, he knew that she was extremely close to having one of her dark fits. "Calm down," he said softly. "You and I both know it is not true. Most of all, your own father knows that is not true, and isn't that the only thing which should matter?" But Calys continued to tremble in silent fury. Damn, this was bad. There were times when Calys going berserk and kicking ass was damn helpful, but this was not one of those times. Changing tacks, he said. A warrior does not let his emotions get the better of him. A full second passed before Calys asked in a not quite Calys voice, "Is that from a movie?" "Of course," Alejandro lied without hesitation. "I'm surprised you don't recognize it." "I don't." Another second. "But you're right." At the same time Raoul sneered. "Do you see how they talk and whisper to each other like lovers? They dare be like that in front of you, the Panthera. They think no one's going to stand in their way to claim the pack's throne." Alejandro's teeth gnashed, and unable to help it, he looked at the panther. He simply looked, and it was enough to have Raoul swallowing. "Do you see how he looks at me?" His voice was shrill with fear. "Do you see?" Alejandro interrupted quietly. "What I see is a panther quaking in his boots, and accusing another man of treason and murder simply because he didn't like being looked at a certain way." Humiliation and rage had Raoul's features twisting into something ugly. "You will pay for that, dog," he snarled. At the slur, Calys had stiffened again, but Alejandro only tightened his hold. "Let me fight my own battles, my princess," he murmured. "I wouldn't be much of a bodyguard if you fight mine for me." "If he knows what's good for him," the princess answered in the same not quite Calys voice. "That will be the last time he'll call you that. If he does it again, I will cut his tongue out and make his own dogs eat it." This time, her words weren't a whisper, and they traveled throughout the room, causing Raoul to curse her in a mixture of fear and fury while the Panthera gazed at her with indecipherable eyes. "We have heard your side, Prince Raoul. Thank you." The words left the panther no recourse but to step down and stand opposite Calys. The older man from the Panthera gestured to Calys. "It is your turn, princess." Alejandro winced at the way Calys briskly walked to the center of the room, her every movement screaming warrior rather than princess. Now was the best time for her to play the role of a vulnerable princess. As a lichen, he abhorred dishonesty above all things, but if it was what would save his little hellcat from being imprisoned and sentenced as a murderess, he wouldn't mind at all if Calys had pretended to mourn Pasquale's death. But of course, even if he had suggested that, he knew Calys wouldn't even consider it. Warriors did not lie after all. "Your last words about the matter, princess? Please say something. I have my alpha's confidence and trust." Girl-like. But he should have known better. She looked at the Panthera one by one, her eyes so guileless it made some of them uncomfortable. His princess PR skills, Alejandro thought with a grimace, definitely had room for improvement. "That is all that I deem necessary." Instead, Calys had basically said screw you to the Panthera if they chose not to believe in her testimony. The spokesperson for the Panthera cleared his throat. "Will that be all, Princess Calys?" She nodded. "Then this meeting is adjourned. We shall convene once again when the Panthera has reached a decision." The Panthera stood up in unison, being the first to leave the room by way of seniority. Raoul and his men quickly followed, clearly not wanting to be left alone with Calys and Alejandro. When they were finally left alone in the room, Alejandro said with a sigh, "You should have learned to use your feminine wiles more." He looked down at Calys as he spoke and was relieved to find her looking like her ordinary self, which meant she was no longer in danger of having a dark fit. Her lips curved in a slight smile as she answered simply, "I can't. Because you're a warrior." Her smile widened. "Because I'm a warrior." They looked at each other and unbidden they simultaneously remembered the last time they had spoken. He was inside her bedroom, and he was breaking her heart. "You made a mistake." Calys was shaking her head at him. "I don't understand." "You made a mistake about saying you love me." "But I didn't." Her voice was tinged with desperation as she told him, "I didn't, Alejandro. I love you. I know I do. I've known it for a long time." "Then I'm sorry. I'm sorry you feel that way." And the sound she had made after that, he didn't think he would ever forget that. Not a single day would he forget the sound, not until the day he died. It was the sound of him completely breaking a warrior's heart. Just like that. Calys had whispered, "After everything you're going to leave me just like that." That was 3 nights ago, but if he had to do it all over again he knew he wouldn't have done anything differently, or maybe he would. His answer would be the same, but maybe he would have tried to make it less hurtful, would have found a way not to have her crying when he told her he didn't love her. In front of him, Calys had turned completely white. Earlier, he would have given everything to have her looking vulnerable like this. But not now, not when he knew it was exactly how she felt, and it was all because of him. Cursing under his breath, he said urgently, "Calys." She shook her head vehemently, her eyes glassy. "You don't have to say thing." She turned away abruptly, as if unable to bear another moment of seeing him. She was practically marching towards the doorway, but he caught up to her easily. "We need to talk about this," he muttered fiercely under his breath as he fell into step behind her, conscious of the proper distance he needed to maintain between cavalier and princess. She shook her head again, running down the stairs 3 steps at a time. Had Alejandro gritting his teeth, and he forced himself to slow down, not wanting her to accidentally trip herself because of her need to get away from him. "Be careful, damn it." Still she ran. He came to a stop. She sensed it and slowed down, but she continued to walk, not looking back. Not even when she had reached the front doors of the inn. His heart clenched at the sight of her leaving him. Was this how Domenico had felt when Misty disappeared on him? This soul-crushing pain, this bone-gnawing fear of never seeing her again and never getting her back? He raked a hand through his hair. He had done the right thing, Alejandro told himself. It was better to draw the lines this early before she fell any harder for him, before he fell any harder for her. It should be enough for both of them that she was his princess and he her cavalier. When he came out of the inn, the first thing he saw was his little hellcat, surrounded by her new family. He still hadn't a fucking clue what they all were. The only thing he knew and did not like was that they had wings. Those damn wings were too powerful by half, and it meant Calys would one day be able to fly away from him, and he would be unable to run after her. He took a step towards them, and they turned to him in unison. The queen, the prince, the knight, and the princess. His princess. Calys. The way they were looking at him, everyone but Calys, made Alejandro rigid with tension. His instincts told him he was better off turning around and walking away. If he didn't give any of them the chance to speak, nothing would change. When he reached her, Calys immediately raised her gaze to him. Her eyes were glassy, but she was able to look at him straight in the eye, as if she was determined to prove to herself she could face her fears. "Calys." She didn't give him a chance to say anything else. "I have spoken with my family, and we have all agreed that this is the best thing to do under the circumstances." She bowed deeply to him, as if in gratitude, and he hated it. He didn't understand why, but her next words explained it. "From here on, you are formally and honorably discharged from your position as cavalier. My sincerest gratitude for the services you have rendered, but after this," her voice broke, "after this, I trust you understand if I tell you I never want to see you." Chapter 2. Calys. "I can't believe you were around all these years and I never knew." I was the first one to break the silence as we reached the gazebo the locals had built at the edge of the town, made of reclaimed wood, the beautiful whitewashed Structure offered stunning views of the bay, and was often rented for mating ceremonies between shifters. I'm not surprised. You never struck me as the sensitive type. This from Jurian, who was not, as it turned out, as gentlemanly as he had portrayed himself to be in the past. Apparently that was all to win my trust. And it worked, I had to admit. It had made me look upon him like a younger brother, with his unassuming boy-next-door air about him, even if he was in fact a couple of years older than I was. Stop teasing your cousin, Yuri. This was from Amalia, my mother, who, as I soon found out, was overly protective of me. The first time we met I had found myself overwhelmed by how much alike we looked. The same blonde hair and blue eyes. We could have passed as twins if she wasn't a head taller than I was. But it's true, Your Majesty. She has this way with words that reminds me of. Jurian pretended to think, then glanced at Amalia in feigned shock. Why, she reminds me of you, Your Majesty. My mother laughed, the sound drawing smiles from all of us, even my brother Vladimir. The prince had black hair and violet eyes, his skin dark. I had heard from Yuri that he took after our father, the king who had gone mad and tried to kill us all. It was probably the reason why he appeared extremely forbidding, his beautiful face rarely softening with a smile. When he saw me looking at him, his voice was quiet and gentle when he asked, "What is it, little sister?" I blurted out, "You need to stop feeling guilty about what happened." The first thing he had said to me when we met was sorry, like he, a 5-year-old boy back then, was responsible for my kidnapping. Behind me the queen gasped, and unease flashed in Jurian's eyes. Vladimir stiffened, but he didn't say a thing, forcing me to continue awkwardly. Every time you look at me I see guilt in your eyes. It's like you're blaming yourself for what happened. You know, he said musingly, they warned me about your candidness. I'm sure they said I was appallingly blunt. Yes, they did. I lifted my shoulders in a helpless shrug. I can't help it. I was raised as a warrior. Jurian, Vladimir, and my mother exchanged looks. We were warned about that too. Amalia was clearly trying not to smile. Seeing my confusion, Jurian explained, in our race girls are, well, girls. I asked slowly, do you mean that I'm the only female Suri who has dark fits? Ah, well, that one is a royal trait, I'm afraid. The prince and the queen share it with you, and so will your eldest sons and daughters. But what I am referring to is your warrior-like ways. Female Suris do not fight at all. I see. I tried not to feel disheartened by the fact. I had hoped that the Suris would be where I'd finally feel normal, but I was beginning to accept that place didn't exist. Amalia reached for my hand. It's all right, you know. Remember, I am the same too. And it's necessary, this difference of ours, because it's what allows us to defend the people we care for. She sent a knowing look to her son. Another royal trait is how we take our responsibilities to heart, too. Much so in some cases. I am to blame, Vladimir said matter-of-factly. I was 5, not 1. Understood what was right and wrong, and I chose to believe that father would change his mind when I overheard him talking to those creatures. It chose wrongly. Amalia raised a brow at me as if asking, do you see what I mean? I certainly did. Vladimir. I paused, trying to search for the right way to tell him it was not his fault. Nothing came, and I ended up resorting to what I usually resorted to when I was lost for words. That pain in your heart. If you think feeling guilty and punishing yourself will make it go away, it won't. You just have to learn to embrace it, you know? It's like what Charles said. Vladimir blinked. Charles. I nodded fervently. The ability to bear the pain without breaking. It's our greatest gift, and it's what makes us stronger. He said carefully. You make sense, but may I ask? I said eagerly. Anything. Who is Charles? Oh, the professor. You know? Charles Xavier, Professor X. Jurian was the first to laugh, followed by my mother, and even the Vladimir cracked a smile. They warned us about that too. I immediately knew what he meant, and I protested. Just because a superhero said it doesn't make it any less true. Vladimir stepped forward and ruffled my hair. It was his first time to touch me, and I felt his immense strength, courage, and power through that touch. You've done well, little sister. With all the adversities you have faced, I am impressed with the way you have remained unblemished with cynicism. His tone was quiet and serious as he said, you are definitely a warrior. I would be proud to have fighting at my side. His words sobered me. They reminded me of the inescapable present and the choices that awaited me. I'm glad you said that. I tried to smile but failed. I'm hoping it won't turn out that way, but if it does, we stand behind you and beside you, daughter. Your enemies are our enemies. Amalia was the one who answered, her voice eerily cold, and when I looked at her I realized that she was and wasn't herself. It was as if her darker half had emerged, but it was under Amalia's control, her dark powers leashed and the queen's to command. I didn't know you could do that, I whispered. Vladimir said, it takes time and practice, but we'll do our best to train you, so that you too may exercise the same control as soon as possible. That would be nice. I'm hoping things will end peacefully, but Amalia laughed, and the sound of it made me shiver. You may wish it as much as you can, but we all know that peace in this situation can only be won by having blood in our hands. Danger flashed in her wise blue eyes. And I will not stop to ensure that it's their blood, not yours, that's shed. Vladimir reached for Mother's hand. Your Majesty, enough. Seconds passed before the ice blue fire in her eyes faded. When we get older, Vladimir explained to me without taking his eyes off, Amalia's turning starts taking a toll on our physical bodies. Amalia's strained face was proof of it, and she wryly admitted as much. I'm afraid it's true, but if you both think that's going to stop me from helping you two in battle, you are dead wrong, of course. Her voice turned extra sweet. Be reminded that I am the queen, and in the end it is what I decide that must be followed. That was true too, but I was determined she'd never have a reason to fight. Seeing my mother weakened after turning, that was what they called my dark fits, was terrifying. I didn't want to lose her when I had just found her. I looked at Vladimir. Maybe if my plan works, there won't be a need to fight. For the sake of your adopted family, my brother said in a chilling voice. I do hope that you are right. Chapter 4. Calys. It has been 3 days, my dear. Amalia spoke the words reluctantly, and I knew she was aware that the words would force me to face reality. The two of us, together with Jurian and Vladimir, were the only ones inside the inn's dining hall. In the days I had spent with the Surus, I came to realize how formalities meant a lot to them. I had grown up enjoying my meals with the entire pack, but it was different for the queen and the prince. They preferred privacy and never spoke about anything important if other people were around, be they Surus or not. Sensing my mother's gaze still on me, I looked away from the windows. I had been looking at windows more often than I wanted, and I know it was because deep inside my heart I was hoping to see Alejandro come back. I'll make a decision today. The words sounded as hollow as I felt. I knew I should be thankful for what my new family had done. They had accomplished the impossible and gathered offers of proposals from the most illustrious and powerful families from just about every non-human race that existed. Whichever proposal I accepted, it would be something that the Panthera wouldn't sneeze at, an alliance that would come more than handy if the prophesied war between good and evil ever came to be. The hours passed, day became night, and my hopes dwindled into nothing. As I joined my family in front of the proposal bearers, I questioned myself why I even cared about waiting for Alejandro. Hadn't he made it clear he would never love me? Would I really sink so low and accept crumbs of his affection when I could have so much more? The rites for selection shall now commence, Jurian said in a strong, clear voice. Like Amalia and Vladimir, my cousin was dressed formally in silver and gold, the colors of the Surus royal family. It should have looked extremely flashy, but somehow Jurian and the others made it work. While my jewelry consisted of silver and gold as well, I wore my pack's colors, a quiet statement of where my loyalties lay first and foremost. The first proposal bearer stepped forward. Greetings from Ryu Delicatzi, current head of the Delicatzi clan of the Karos. And so it went until 34 proposals had been formally offered. Amalia inclined her head regally in acknowledgement. Before we proceed, please convey my gratitude to your leaders for their prompt response. It is much appreciated. She looked at me. Princess. Before I could answer, my brother moved forward. I believe we have one last candidate left. Amalia was visibly surprised, but then Jurian went to her saying something too low for me to hear, and she nodded in understanding. I see. When she straightened, she glanced at me with unreadable eyes. Apparently the prince is right. There is one last candidate for you to consider. Almost as if on cue, the doors opened, and the first one I saw was my own father, Veneto Adelardi. But he was not alone. Behind him was Domenico Moretti, the infamous heir of the most powerful Lycan pack, and next to the werewolf prince was his younger brother Alejandro. Father. My voice was faint with shock. My dear, Veneto said, his eyes twinkling despite his tired appearance. His eyes met the Queen's. Your Majesty. My mother's answering smile was warm. It's a pleasure to finally meet the man who has taken great care of Calys. I hope you may grant me a moment of your time tonight. I would love to personally extend my gratitude for being there. For my daughter. She paused. Our daughter. When I couldn't be. Veneto visibly relaxed at the Queen's words, and it was only then I realized that he had been wary about the kind of welcome he would receive from my birth. Mother. It would be my pleasure to speak with you, Your Majesty. His tone was gruff with emotion. He glanced sideways at Domenico, and his voice took on a wry note. I must confess, however, that meeting Your Majesty was not the only reason I have come here. As you may know, my lands have been unfortunately subjected to a good deal of upheaval. It is for this reason that I greatly welcome the proposal Domenico Moretti presented me with. Proposal? From Domenico Moretti? But he's married, I gasped. Silence. My father looked like he badly wanted to laugh while none of my family wanted to meet my gaze. The other proposal bearers, however, had no qualms. Half of them were grinning. The others were also avoiding my eyes discreetly. I looked at my father in confusion. Well, wasn't he? Unbidden, I found myself looking at Alejandro. That one looked like he wanted to kill me. Finally, Domenico Moretti cleared his throat. Like his younger brother, he possessed the same black hair and green eyes as well as the tall, lean build the Morettis were known for. All in all, he looked a lot more handsome and intimidating than what rumors led me to believe, and when his intense gaze landed on me, I did my best not to fidget, not wanting him to think I was some silly princess. His lips twitching, Domenico said solemnly, Yes, I am indeed married and will stay that way permanently. He glanced at the younger man beside him, one who had remained silent all this time. Again I found my gaze straying towards him, and when our eyes met, he snarled. You idiot! I gasped, but everyone around me burst into laughter. Even Vladimir cracked a smile. Didn't I tell you? Alejandro snapped as he stalked towards me. You don't need another prince other than me. You don't need another cavalier other than me. You don't need anyone but me. He shook my shoulders hard with each word. But, he growled. I'm the one proposing marriage. Idiot. He said it with such furious relish it was as if he was dying to say it to me 100 times more. I echoed disbelievingly. Marry? You? Yes, he roared. I'm the one who's proposing marriage, and if you know what's good for you, mine is the only proposal you'll consider. My head reeled. Alejandro was breathing hard, and he looked like he was having an internal struggle. Half of him seemed to want to strangle me, the other half wanted to do, well, unspeakable stuff. When he cupped my face, I couldn't help but tremble. His voice low, he said, I cannot and will never love you, Calys, but I offer you everything in me, my life, my honor, my strength, and if you marry me, he knelt down on one knee, I also offer you the entire might of the Moretti pack. In the background, gasps and whispers abounded, for the promise he made was no small thing. To have Alejandro Moretti as my cavalier was already a feat in itself, and that was only with no one knowing he also happened to be the masked wolf. But to have the entire Moretti pack fighting for us, warriors who were almost as good as Alejandro but just as loyal and cunning? Alejandro held my hand and touched his lips to my knuckles. Choose me, princess, and I swear to be the warrior who will win every battle for you. Calys. Excuse me, but do you know where my father's gone? I tried not to sound desperate as I asked the panther stationed at the end of the hallway leading to Veneto's room. I had been to his room and Amelia's, hoping to catch sight of Veneto, but he wasn't in either place. Paolo appeared surprised by my question. I thought he was with you. In his mid-40s, he had worry lines on his forehead, something I was sure had to do with the monumental task of looking after my father. Veneto hated having guards with him, seeing them as babysitters he didn't need. At his reply, it was my turn to be bewildered. Me? But I haven't talked to Him since we met at the hall. Paul scratched his head. Well, that was what the pack leader told me. He'd be meeting you at the back, I think. Oh, maybe he sent someone around to ask for me. Veneto, like most old school pack leaders, didn't own a mobile phone. I'll go look for him there. Thanks, Paolo. Do you want me to come with you? No, it's all right. But maybe if I miss him again and you see him first, could you tell him to wait for me? Turning around, I headed to the back, hoping I would indeed find my father. There. I badly needed to talk to him. I had to know if Veneto was aware of what was between Alejandro and me, needed to be sure that he was aware he had practically given the werewolf prince the right to break my heart over and over by showing his support for Alejandro's proposal. Just the thought of what happened back at the hall had me stumbling on my own feet. I couldn't believe he had said all those things, and they were both the best and worst things he could say. The good part: he promised me an army any general would be proud to lead. The bad part: he also promised he would never be able to love me. The urge to cry and laugh was almost uncontrollable, and I took several deep breaths trying to control my hysteria. Going through the inn's back doors, I called out, "Father!" It was completely dark outside, which was strange. There was a beautiful garden here, one that was usually ablaze with lights because the owners of the inn were extremely proud of it. Taking a step onto the stone path, I moved forward and called out again, "Father!" No one answered, not even a single cricket cricking, and that was when it struck me. It was too silent here. Too silent. The whole place smacked of danger that had gone past, danger that didn't make me have a dark fit because it was not directed at me. It was directed at someone else. Oh God, no. All thoughts of Alejandro fled, and all I could think about was Veneto. My heart racing in fear, I called out again, "Father!" In the darkness, something caught my eye, a glint of metal. A sword. Heart in my throat, I ran towards the spark, my mind blank with terror. Please, let it not be him. Please let it not be him. Please let it not be him. The stone path curved to the left, and there I saw it, an upright sword. New. Tears of disbelief streaked down my cheeks as I rushed towards where my father lay unmoving on the ground, his own sword protruding from his blood-stained chest. Crashing down on my knees, I reached for his shoulders with shaking hands. "Father! Please God, please make him open my eyes. Please." But his eyelids remained closed. Clasping the hilt of his sword with both hands, I pulled it carefully out of his body. Behind me, someone gasped. My head twisted around, and I found two men halted in their tracks at the sight of Veneto's dead body on the ground, my hands on the sword that killed him. Dear Lord! The whisper came from Benito, the head of the panthers' face turning a sickly shade of white. The second man was Raul. "What have you done, Calys?" His voice was filled with hurt incredulity, but in his eyes was the truth, the real feelings he felt, and they were nothing but triumph. And I knew. I cried. And when I looked at him, I was no longer my. Chapter 5. Alejandro. The first inkling he had of the trouble brewing around him was something that couldn't be explained. It was more than feeling someone had just walked over Alejandro's grave. Rather, someone had jumped on it over and over, each footfall harder than the last. Pay attention, the person over his grave seemed to scream. Pay attention before Calys dies. The mug he held in his hand crashed to the floor, and the people around him became silent and wary, their warrior bodies going taut as they waited for their prince to explain his actions. Seated next to him at the head of the table, Domenico Moretti asked calmly, "What happened?" The noise in the bar was reduced to nothing when he spoke. All the shifters inside on the alert. They too had started to sense the same thing that was making Alejandro restless. And then they all heard it. No. It was Calys, screaming like someone had just taken her life. Alejandro broke into a run, and so did Domenico and the rest of their pack. Chairs crashed to the floor in their wake as they burst out of the bar, none of them bothering to hide their shifter speed. The air about them was raw with violence, telling them there was no second to lose. Over and over he heard the sound of Calys screaming, and it made Alejandro run harder and faster, feeling all the while he wasn't running hard or fast enough. His sense of smell showed him the way, and they all headed towards the back of the inn. He smelled death, and it made him bristle with fear and aggression. When they reached the back of the inn, everyone was fighting. Adelardi, panthers against each other, and other panthers against Surus, their wings tensely drawn against their backs, just a second away from spreading open to give them an aerial advantage over their opponents. His gaze searched the battle scene wildly, and he found her a moment later. Calys. She was alive. Thank the fuck she was alive. Relief crashed into him as he stared at her, and that was when he realized she was not quite herself. She was having one of her dark fits, and it was extremely clear that she was hell-bent on killing Raul. The younger man was on the ground fighting for his life. He shifted into his panther form the next second, but it made no difference. Calys was relentless in her attack. Every swing of her father's sword deadly in its precision. Metal clashed against claws, wounding both skin and fur. Raul's gaze found him. Stop her, he demanded in a voice made shrill with fear. She's gone mad, he gasped. She's killed her own father and now she wants to kill me. Alejandro tore off towards them, knowing he couldn't allow Calys to kill Raul without any justification. Once her rage died, he knew she would blame herself forever for it, and he didn't want that kind of burden on her. Princess, stop. He managed to step between Raul and Calys. Get out of my way. Her eyes blazed with fury as she struck at him hard, enough to send him flying. It was the distraction Raul was waiting for, giving him the time to scramble away. He knew he would never win against Calys. He had known her far too long to underestimate her skills, but it also made him aware of her weakness. She was a warrior, and warriors had their silly codes of honor. By the time Calys faced him, Raul held Veneto's lifeless form in his arms. If you take my life, know that I will take your father's form with me. He'll die scarred and dismembered, nothing like the warrior he was in real life. To show her he meant it, he drew a line on Veneto's throat and blood started to seep out. Calys screamed at the sight of Veneto's neck being slowly decapitated. Memories assailed her of Veneto playing with Calys and Anastasia, tossing their young bodies in the air at the same time before catching them one by one. Of Veneto patiently teaching her to wield a sword while Anastasia clapped every time Calys was able to bring their father down. Of Veneto telling her he was so proud of her, and that she and Anastasia were children of his heart. Her dark half relinquished control of Calys' body, and she came back to herself with a cry, the sword dropping from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Her tear-blurred eyes sought Raul's. Stop. She would never forgive himself. If Veneto ended up beheaded because of her quest for justice, you can do anything you want, just please don't make my father any less of a warrior. Call off everyone on your side, Raul snarled. Without taking her eyes off Veneto, she said hoarsely, you heard him. One by one, the Suris, the Lycans, and the Adelardi panthers loyal to her stepped back, a traditional symbol of ceasefire among non-humans. The tension on Raul's face eased, and his smile turned feral. Too late. Alejandro caught the look the panthers sent to his men. No, but dozens of panthers had rushed at him, preventing him from reaching Calys in time. The last thing he saw before going berserk was a panther striking Calys' head from behind. Alejandro, you have to talk to me at some point. 2 days had passed since Veneto's lifeless form had been discovered. 2 days of Calys being locked in the dungeon, something all shifter towns secretly possessed because of its unusually strong inhabitants. Unlike most others, however, Midtown's was natural rather than man-made, painstakingly built from damp stone caves underneath the Everglades. Thick steel bars that were spaced only inches apart made up its cages, and the keys to its heavy locks had been turned over to the Panthera. Both of them were seated on the ground, Calys' knees huddled close under her chin while Alejandro lay against the cave's walls, one leg propped up. Her silence ate at him, making his chest squeeze painfully. Talk to me, princess, please. But Calys only looked at him, her face wan and her gaze blank. She had not been eating for days, and only the knowledge that he would bring war to his race and hers kept Alejandro from forcibly breaking her out. Above them, the Panthera remained locked in a meeting, Raul doing his best to force the elders of his race to condemn Calys for killing Veneto Adelardi. The Panthera was traditional to the core. Calys' judgment would depend on their decision as a whole. DNA evidence did not mean anything to them, but even if it did, Alejandro knew the tests he had secretly asked his men to carry out would yield no clues. He had studied Veneto's corpse, and it had been a swift, clean kill with no signs of a struggle. Veneto had known the killer, and he had not expected the other person to be his murderer. His gaze returned to Calys. It was clear she was still in shock, her devastation over Veneto's death making her drown in self-pity. You need to snap out of it. His voice was tight with worry, gripping the bars that separated them. He demanded, "Aren't you worried about your sister?" He had only recently learned about her human sister from the Surus, and apparently it was the girl that he had overheard Stefan talking to. Calys finally looked at him, but her tone was dull when she said, "Stefano. We'll look after her." They were the first words she had spoken, and Alejandro's eyes held hers. Immediately, not willing to let Calys drown herself in her grief once more. "And what about your pack?" Her body jerked at the mention of her family, the first sign of life she had shown. It gave Alejandro hope, making him press on. "If you continue to stay like this, what do you think will happen to your pack? They will be under your cousin's rule." She shook her head. "I don't want to hear this. Tough, because you will hear it whether you want to or not." She clapped her hands over her ears. "I just want to." Her voice choked. "Just want to grieve. It's my fault father's dead. My fault. My fault. My fault." She started beating her chest. "Stop it. My fault, my fault." His temper ignited the same time his fear over her hurting herself rose, and he snarled, "Stop it, damn it." When she kept crying and beating herself, he roared, "Stop with the self-pity. Veneto raised you as a warrior, then fucking act like it." Calys froze. The pain etched on her face was so raw it made him ache to take her in his arms, but he knew that it wasn't comfort she needed from him. That would come later. Right now, she needed him to make her strong, and if he had to lash out at her to do it, then that was what he was going to damn well do. "Tonight is my last chance to be with you, Calys. I've made sure that none of Raoul's men are near enough to hear us. They all think we're doing." Alejandro grimaced. Calys asked faintly, "Doing what?" Sex, Alejandro thought. It had been the only rational explanation for his desire for privacy, and it was better than have everyone realize that instead they were plotting to extract vengeance. "Never mind what they think. You only need to know that this is the only time I can talk to you." He paused, disliking what he had to say next. "The Panthera has asked me and my brother to leave. He's asked the same of your new family." Everything inside him roared in protest against the very idea, but he knew that it was necessary, not just because disobeying could bring war, but also because doing so was tantamount to their plan. Forcing himself to continue, Alejandro said, "Benito says that your race desires to mourn Veneto's passing in private, but I fear doing so makes him fall right into Raoul's hands." When Calys' eyes widened, Alejandro knew she had understood perfectly what he meant. Drawing her breath unevenly, she whispered, "You can't be serious." "He can't." "Why? How could he even think he'd get away with killing the entire Panthera?" His eyes bored through hers. "The same way he or whoever it is he asked to kill your father managed to get away with it. He would make it appear that you were the one behind it." Calys looked down at her hands. In a low whisper she said, "I barely managed to control myself back then. If I see him again, I know I'm going to kill him. If our plan works, you will have the right to." "But Princess." Her to look at him, and when her blue eyes met his, he said emphatically, "None of this will work if you don't get a grip on yourself." His voice hardened. "Do you understand, Calys? If you truly want to avenge your father, you need to promise to yourself that you will be strong." Several seconds of silence passed before she whispered, "On my word as a warrior. Chapter 6. Calys. Everything in my body knew the moment Alejandro Moretti and the rest of his pack left. It was an absence that slowed down the beat of my heart, made my skin prickle in uneasy awareness and my muscles freeze. Raoul came down to the dungeon as soon as they left, and my dark half snarled and demanded to be let out the moment I saw him. "Patience. Patience. We can't kill him now," I whispered to my darker side. He strutted towards the cage, looking and acting more peacock than panther. Smelled his fear underneath his arrogant stance and knew he still remembered the terrified state he was in when I had the sword in my hands over his body. When he reached my cage, he spat at me. His saliva dripped down my face and I wiped it away silently with my shackled wrists. You know you'll rot here until you're sentenced to be beheaded, don't you? Little cousin. I only looked at him silently, not trusting myself to speak. I focused on his face, my gaze unblinking as I started counting the ways I could torture him. 1. Castration. Not going to say anything, he sneered. 2. Pull out his nails slowly, one at a time. Uncle Veneto was wrong to trust a monster like you. He had been nothing but generous to you, and how did you repay him? You had a dog between your legs and you began to kill every panther that got in your way. It dawned on me that he was speaking too loudly, like he wanted the people above us to hear him. 3. Skin him alive, peel his fur inch by inch. If I hadn't been raised to respect the panthera, I wouldn't bother waiting for their sentence. I'd have given you to my men and let them treat you like the slut that you are, and when they're done, I'll have you chopped into pieces and fed to the dogs you so love. I doubt they'd know the difference. 4. Slice his scalp open and turn his brain into a pincushion. He spat at me again. If you're smart, you'll be praying for a quick death at their hands. 5. Sew every opening in his body shut. From his eyes, his ears, nose, mouth, and even the slit in his cock. Every damn opening. As he turned away, I whispered, you should pray for the same too, cousin. The words had Raoul tripping on his own feet. Should have made me smile, but it didn't. Maybe when my hands had turned red with his blood, I would regain my sense of humor. Raoul and his men left not soon after, just like Alejandro had predicted he would. When the massacre happened, Raoul would not be in the scene, which provided him an alibi of sorts. I counted the seconds, needing them to be far enough to be out of earshot before I made my move. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. I stood up. Vladimir or Amalia hadn't gotten around to teaching me how to control my dark fits, but I didn't think I had to worry about that in this case. What I felt, she felt. What I knew, she knew, and what mattered to me mattered to her. Tonight, we both knew, was all about retribution. 20 minutes. I closed my eyes. 25 minutes. When I opened my eyes, both of us were awake and both of us wanted to kill. Metal bars bent and curved under my fingers like they were made of plastic. The screeching sound had the guards rushing down into the dungeon. By the time I stepped out of my cage, they were all in front of me, fear written all over their faces. I recognized them as guards of the Panthera. For that reason alone, I would do my best not to kill them. You can try to hurt me or capture me, but do not try to kill me, or I will kill you. I took a step forward and they all took a step back, and it was like an impromptu dance between us. They looked at each other, as if needing themselves to be brave as one unit, before charging towards me at the same time. A minute later and they were all groaning in the ground, their injuries rendering them temporarily immobile. Not even their shifter blood would be able to heal them quickly enough to stop me. When I reached the surface, there was no sign of any other panthers, neither foe nor ally was around, and it only meant one thing. What Alejandro predicted had indeed come to pass, and tonight either Raoul or I would die. I walked alone in the dark, the inhabitants of Midtown all shut safely inside their homes. Either they knew what was going on or they were sensitive enough to the undercurrents in the air and knew better than to interfere. The first attack came the moment I stepped past the town borders. A steel arrow swooshed from the north. I caught it handily and broke it into two with a snap of my fingers. A torrent of arrows followed, together with a shower of bullets, but it was too late. I ran too fast for them to hit me, and their own weapons became my tracking device, exposing their location like a predator, finding its prey's jugular. They saw me coming, but that was all they could do. See, it was the last thing they could do. For their eyes, all their eyes were just like Raoul's. Evil, greed, soulless. Bones broke, necks snapped, spines crushed. The second wave of attack came as soon as I eyed where Raoul hid and waited in all his cowardice. A fortress that belonged to his mother. It had been a home to warriors once, but now because of him the place would be a mass grave. It broke my heart to see members of my own pack rushing towards me. Veneto had loved them all, every damn one of them, and this was how they would return his love. If they had no mercy or love for him, then I had none of the same for them. With them, vengeance would be extra sweet. Around us the wind started to howl from nowhere, strong gusts of wind that had the leaves rustling, branches swaying, the sounds mingling with the screams that came from traitorous panthers whose flesh I ripped apart with my hands. They came at me like an endless mass, hatred and desperation making them wildly violent. But they had no chance. No chance. Not one bit. And bit by bit, the land underneath my feet became soft and squishy with the strips of their flesh. The fortress doors were barricaded, but it took me nothing to pry them out of the way. Finally I saw Raoul. He was surrounded by 100 shifters, paid assassins, and many of their faces were familiar. After tonight I thought absently the den would find itself suffering from a sudden shortage of fighters. Raoul was stupid as ever, and the proof of it was the absence of fear in his eyes. He thought he had numbers on his side and he said as much. More are coming this way, bitch. You can keep killing, but it will take you an entire day before you can reach me long enough for me to have the entire race under my reign. Outside, the wind howled louder, making Raoul frown as he fought against the distraction it presented. He really was an idiot. Just tell me, I said softly. That's all I ask. Tell me who killed father. He bared his fangs in a sneering smile. I wish I could say it was me, but unfortunately I only played a small part of it. The words had my dark half stirring, but I made her wait, knowing that we had to keep Raoul alive long enough for the truth to be known. I told him the three of us should talk privately, that you were already waiting for him at the back of the inn. And my entire body shook at the effort I had to exert to keep myself still and not make all my dreams come true. Since the time I had left the dungeon I had counted 135 ways to torment him, and more ideas still poured into the back of my mind. Veneto was old. He was nothing like he used to be, even if he does act like he still got it. My man had his sword in a second and he never even got to defend himself. I bowed my head as the truth washed over me. It hurt to hear how Veneto had died, but somehow it was also liberating, and a part of me was grateful that he had not suffered. Nothing to say before I kill you? I do. Slowly I looked up at him. Did you really think you could get away with it? I already did, Raoul bragged. Because at this very moment my men are killing the entire Panthera, and it will all be blamed on you. No. I stepped forward, and despite having 100 men with him, Raoul inched back. They're not. Consternation twisted his face. You think you can make me believe your foolish words? He stopped speaking as a strange, loud sound interrupted him. It came from above, and unease wafted through his army of assassins as they saw the fortress' heavy roof start to shake. Outside, the wind howled louder than ever. Raoul was staring at me. You can't be behind this, he gasped. I didn't answer, knowing I didn't have to. A second later, the whole roof was smashed apart and dark shadows began to fall hard and fast. And that was when they saw where the wind was coming from. Oddly, I remembered the times Veneto would tuck me into bed and read my favorite superhero comics with me. It's not a bird. It's not a plane. Tears fell down my eyes as one after another, Surus flew down, and their large, strong wings were so powerful that together they had made it appear like a storm was approaching. In each of their arms was a passenger, a lichen, or a member of the Panthera, and all of them had heard every word Raoul spoke, their presence undetected because they had come to the fortress from the skies where no one was watching. Raoul was shaking in fear as the realization that his defeat was imminent became clear to him. He looked at me. Calys. I shook my head slowly. You will die. Alejandro. The battle was a bloodbath, but it was evident from the very start which side would win. Even so, he fought his way to be close to Calys, needing to be sure that he would be there to protect her even if his help was unnecessary. He found her with Raoul, and the younger man was on the ground, begging for his life. But one look at Calys' face told him mercy would not be granted, and rightly so. She had gotten her father's sword back and she slashed at the Panthera. She forced him to a corner. Please, I can tell you what the others are planning, Raoul babbled. But he ended up howling in pain as Calys' sword sliced his face, leaving wounds on both his eyes. I'm not your only enemy, Raoul screamed. I know that, Raoul, Calys answered in her sing-song voice. But you're the only enemy I want to kill right now. And then she began to slice him into pieces, starting from his ankles so exactly it was as if Raoul's body was like a diagram. By the time she reached his intestines, Alejandro realized that the interval was the exact distance between the steel bars of her cage and the dungeon. Even when Raoul was long dead, Calys remained standing next to his body, unmoving. It was as if the battle taking place around them didn't exist. Every bit of her concentration focused on his corpse. He stopped a foot away from her, knowing it would be utter stupidity to approach Calys from behind when she was having a dark fit. Princess. In an instant, Calys had whirled around and her father's sword was pointed at his throat. There was nothing of his princess in those baby blue eyes. It was all her twin, all darkness and none of her light. You will die for hurting her. They were the only words she spoke before she lunged for him. Unlike with Raoul, she did not bother to toy with him. She was deadly serious, and he was forced to be just as serious as he tried to defend himself without hurting her. Don't do this. Twisting around, he grasped a sword lying on the ground just in time to parry another killing thrust from Calys. Why shouldn't I? You hurt her. Rage burned in her eyes at the sight of the weapon in his hand, and she became even more aggressive, always going for spots that could maim his head, his neck, his heart. You don't want to do this. Swords clashed. You hurt her. I could feel her pain, Calys' dark twin hissed. It was almost like she was dying. He whitened at the words, and it was all she needed. In another instant, she had him flat on the ground, her sword against his throat. She looked down at him as if waiting. Those eyes were not Calys. Those eyes belonged to a killer, one who only knew right and wrong and nothing in between. Looking into those eyes, Alejandro tasted fear for the very first time. But it was not fear for his life. Looking into those eyes, he knew that he could die any moment, and yet only one memory kept playing in his mind. I love you. I know I do. I've known it for a long time. From afar he heard Calys' twin speaking. You hurt her. I could feel her pain. It was almost like she was dying. In his mind he saw himself speaking, killing Calys like her dark twin had said, his every word a stab to her heart. Then I'm sorry. I'm sorry you feel that way. Above him he heard Calys' dark half ask, why have you stopped fighting? His gaze met hers, but all he saw was the look of betrayal on Calys' face when he told her she was wrong to love him. If only he could take it back. If only he had the chance to talk to her before he died, then he would tell her she was right. She loved him and he loved her. The sword pressed harder against his throat, drawing blood. Answer me, Wolf, he said hoarsely. Because I can't take the risk of killing you if I try to escape. Then you will let me kill you instead? If that's what it takes to keep you alive. Her eyes narrowed. You are not lying. No, I'm not. Her head cocked to the side. Why did you hurt her? Her sword pressed deeper against his neck as she spoke, a relentless punishment that told him very clearly he meant nothing to this side of Calys. Because I was a fool. That's all. Again the sword pushed deeper, and he began to taste his own blood. But still, he managed to speak evenly, saying, not all. Her voice cold with impatience, she asked, then what else? If you do kill me, make her believe it was an accident, and tell her that I admitted to you that I love her. His chest constricted at the words, which made him feel too goddamn vulnerable and weak. Because I do love her. When Calys' dark half made a move, he didn't blink, wanting Calys' lovely face to be the last thing he saw before he died. But instead of killing him, her dark twin had tossed her sword to the side, bent down and whispered into his ear, you must give her time to heal and be strong again. If you love her, you must